Good afternoon and welcome to International Investing for all life stages. So today I have two of my colleagues with me who are going to share their real life examples. So I'd like to welcome Tumi and Carnette today.
Thanks, Tracy. Thank you, Tracy, for having us.
Thanks for joining. So before we get into their exact life cases, I just wanted to touch briefly on what we discussed in the previous webinar because we are going to be referring to it. And it's quite important in the context. So in the previous webinar a few months ago, which if you would like to view the recording, it is on our YouTube channel, we covered the why, how, and what of international investing. It was quite surprising, actually. We did a poll on why South Africans want to invest internationally. And the primary reason came out as diversification. And I was surprised that it was so valid because sometimes it feels like it's a bit of an emotional response to what's happening in the country or with the currency. And it's very valid because South Africa's economy is less than 0.5% of the entire world. So a very, very small speck compared to all of the investments that are available. We also then covered exactly practically how do you do it if you would like to open an account, and then what the different types of investments are. So there's primarily two different types. The one is investments accessible in Rand. So this is like buying any other investment in South Africa. Very simple, very easy. The second option is to actually go and take your Rands and convert it to a foreign currency and purchase, for example, dollars and go buy an investment outside of the country. So if we come back to those reasons why we would have the investments, the Rand-based option ticks two of the three boxes. It will give us that diversification we're looking for. It will give us protection against currency depreciation. But for those investors that want access to the money outside of South Africa or they're concerned about political risk, it is not going to meet that need. On the other hand, the option that's in foreign currency will tick all of the boxes as to why we would want such an investment. So the three funds we're going to focus on today, and they're more types of funds. Under bucket one, which is Rand-based investments, we've got what we're calling local funds, and we're calling them local because they are predominantly local. They would have a maximum of about 30% in international investments. And that pie chart we've got there, we're going to use in our infographics later. So you can see the majority of it is housed locally. The second one is a feeder fund, which all that means is we use an analogy of a coffee cup, like you would put a collar on your coffee cup, like if you go to Vida or Seattle and they give you something not to burn your hands, but it's the exact same content. So that's fully housed in international investments, but you're accessing it in Rand, so it's simple. And you can see there we've got a cog and wheel with spokes. And then the last one, which is your foreign denominated international investments, we've used there a logo of the world. And this again would be fully invested offshore. So these are the three items we're going to touch on. So that was why it was important to just have a little bit of a recap on that. So really, let's get to the main purpose of today, which is to take real life case studies. And there's 4 real life case studies we're going to discuss. The first is when you're getting started, your very, very first job, when you're starting out. From there, a few years down the line, you tend to have growing responsibilities. Now, the picture here has a baby, but it's different things for different people. It could be a car you've purchased, it could be property, it could be an array of things. But as you become more established, you start to have more expenses. And from there, we will move to sort of an older phase, a more established phase where you're more focused on wealth creation. And then finally, which we don't have today, I'm going to be your retired person using my dad as an example, but we will move to the last case study. So to get started with, we're going to speak to Tumi, who I know you're not starting out on work yet.
No, not anymore.
But we are going to look back and remember those days. We don't want to give away our ages here. So I remember my early days when I started working and, investments wasn't much of a priority. But if you think back, what was life like at that stage?
Yeah. Thanks, Tracy. And yes, I definitely agree with you. Maybe just to give you some context, with me, a savings culture wasn't something that was embedded in me growing up. So, we spent a lot of time, or the focus was ensuring that our day-to-day costs were covered or month-to-month costs were covered. And that is what I carried with me when I started my first job. So first thing was, ensuring that my rent was paid, because now I've got the freedom, making sure that my car installment was paid, making sure that I had enough fuel to get me, from my place to work. And unfortunately, my entertainment budget was a big chunk of my salary. So when it came to, saving or investments, it was really through the retirement fund at work and really nothing else. So a lot of my time really was spent spending.
I remember those early days. I think almost every weekend I went shopping, and then was the J&P mates when we were still allowed to go out without masks in those days. But yeah, I had very little focus on savings. But I remember, like, sometime into my first job, I remember thinking, sure, you need to sort out yourself and be responsible now. And I was just curious if you had a similar experience.
No, exactly. So for me, it happened with my car. So I had bought a second-hand car, nothing wrong with that, I thought. And it was out of motor plan. And unfortunately, I had no emergency savings because, again, most of it went to my entertainment budget. So I had no emergency savings, and I found myself now having to either, go into an overdraft or use my credit card. And at that point, I thought, this is really not sustainable. I need to be thinking a little bit, better about having a little bit of money or a bit of a nest egg for me. So, the easiest thing for me at the time was opening up unit trusts, which I did. I happened to work for an asset manager at the time, so that was the sort of the natural thing for me to do. I suppose if I wasn't, I would have probably opened up another savings account or money market or something to that effect. So it was really the retirement fund for my company, and again the unit trusts. But yeah, that really changed my shift, and I've got to be a little bit more responsible with my money now.
So I think you're in a very fortunate position, because most of us, as you're saying, when you're starting out, you feel like you need to do something, you're not sure what you need to do, you sort of, okay, I need to get more responsible, and you at least have that input. But I mean, today's focus is obviously on international investments. So I was just curious, I mean, was that something that even came onto your radar at that stage?
Not at all. I mean, again, it was just the day to day, month to month. It was really nothing that I thought about. Again, it was, I think, something that I thought about when I'm older, and it seems so complicated, and I must have a lot of money to do it. So it was nothing that I ever really thought about, no.
I mean, it was the same for me. So I'd really like to summarize this with an infographic, because I think it helps people identify with where they're at. And so we discussed on, your emergency savings, which is very short term. So that would be sort of your less than 5-year bucket. And there you wouldn't really have international investments, because it's something you need, you could need tomorrow, you could need, if your car breaks as an example, you could need it very shortly. Then the other savings, which I also remember being forced, I'll say, into having a company retirement fund, because at that time I thought I was going to make millions later and have this amazing, I don't know what that I was going to do to make these millions. But there your company normally does it on your behalf. So typically they would automatically put you into what we've classed this local fund, where you've got a portion there, most of it in local, a little bit in international, and there you are capped at a maximum of 30%. So that's a bit of a regulatory thing. But I just want to come back to me, because there was one thing that wasn't available when we started working, giving away our ages here today, and that was tax-free savings accounts. And I know it's something now I find very useful for. I don't know if that's something you're using or looking at currently.
As I've gotten older and have gained more responsibilities, I find that it was really one of the the easy avenues or easy way in order for me to to save up. So yeah, unfortunately we didn't have it then, but glad that we do have it now.
Yeah, no, great. So this is a really great way, coming back to the infographic, for you to have longer term savings. And the reason for that is your returns are growing tax-free. So because this is designed for such long-term savings, it's a great way to hold a fair amount of international investments where the volatility of that currency means it's ideally suited to a longer horizon. And there you can use a feeder fund, you can use the local fund that has some international, but you're typically looking at holding more than 50% in international in that bucket. You cannot purchase a fully fledged international fund here because of the structure. So I think that gives a nice high-level overview of the getting started phase. We are now going to move into the next phase. So Tumi is now in a very different phase of her life.
Oh, yes.
She has beautiful boy-girl twins that are 1 year old. So tell us how life is for you today, Tumi.
Very different. So a big chunk of my salary does not go towards entertainment, but towards the household. So from then until now, a couple of things had happened. Got married, bought a house, moved, and had children. Wow. So now, of course, your expenses have now grown, which means you've got to now start thinking about how, one, you're going to meet those short-term expenses, but how you're going to go about actually saving for them. So things like education, for example, being front and center. So luckily I had those unit trusts that I had before, building on that portfolio, making use of those tax-free investments. And then I had to start, okay, maybe now offshore might be something to think about, which I really wasn't actively doing until I watched your webinar where you were talking about accessing offshore investments in different ways. While I'd been trying to diversify and even looking to things like cryptocurrency, I found opening a feeder fund account to be a lot easier. Actually, in all of 5 minutes it was done, and that was one of the ways in which I've gone about diversifying my portfolio, and then of course saving for the long term, which in this sense is for their education.
Yeah, so sure, a lot has happened in the last few years. So I think there were a few really great things that you mentioned there. Now it's not just emergencies, you have to save up for a house, so you've got those sort of shorter term savings at some point, which again, you wouldn't have much international. You're going to use it soon, unless you were going to immigrate and buy a house somewhere else. But really what I want to talk to you today is about your children's savings. So as we said, they're still very young. And I know you've mentioned a few things, but can you tell us a little bit more around how you're thinking about saving for them? Because there's always this fear, yes, I've got to meet their needs now, but I've also got to save for later. Have I done enough? Can I give them the life I want to give them?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if I'm putting it down to being a first-time mom or not, but you want to make sure you're covering all your bases. So you're like, I need to make sure that I've got enough money, need to diversify as much as I can. So you've got your different, education policies, and these people call you up and they say, listen, we've got this. You're like, I'll take that. And you being in the financial services industry, you would think, I should know better, I should stay focused, do my research, but I found myself now wanting to almost grab everything that was out there, hence then also looking into cryptocurrency. So I think, again, in terms of international investing and then looking at how the markets have done and knowing that they've got, the time frame to go through those volatilities, then I thought, okay, I think definitely offshore. And again, using the feeder fund for me was a lot easier because my life is complicated enough. So I wanted something that was simple and easy.
No, I think, that's, again, great points. Often in the industry, everybody thinks we're got our own lives all sorted and we're perfect and we must be ticking all the boxes. But like you're saying, super busy, I'm sure, with 1 year old twins that are now walking. You've got a lot of things on your mind. And I think it's a great point to highlight that the feeder fund really is 5 minutes or less to open, and we make it out in our minds. I think, sure, if I'm going to invest internationally, there's going to be a lot of effort and time, and it's quite a heavy lifting I need to do here. But in reality, it's actually not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And then the other thing I just wanted to highlight that you mentioned was being a mom and wanting to make sure you've got the right investments that are well diversified, because you've got a long horizon till your children need the money. And I think that's why international is so great in that context. And not just because not everybody has children, but any long-term investment really where you have the time, it's great because, as I said, South Africa is a little speck compared to the world economy, and that really meets that need, that concern of, have I invested it appropriately across a wide range of investments?
Yeah.
So
thanks,
thank
Tracy.
you, Tumi.
Thank you.
Okay, so to wrap that all up with an infographic, so you can see, very, very similar structure to the previous one. where, you know, you've still got this need for short-term savings for emergencies, maybe saving for a house or a car. And there again, you have very little international. It's not really that relevant. Then for those people who do have children, a tax-free savings account, again, in the name of your children, is a great option. And especially when they're young, you've got a lot of scope to hold international, which again is simple because it's a feeder fund or it's the local fund, which is very easy. You cannot legally own the international fund in a foreign currency here. But I also just wanted to tie that in for people who don't have children. Any very long-term savings goal where you want that diversification, as we spoke about, a goal sort of more than 5 years, really you're looking at having a fair portion of international. And we've summarized it there at the bottom in the infographic. You're ideally looking to have about 30 to 50% in international in this segment. So from here, we're going to move to the next life stage, which is the more established life stage. Sorry, Connor.
See?
And his little icon, I know he wasn't very impressed when I sent him the presentation because there was limited choices.
You're forgiven, it's fine.
Thank you. He has grey hair and in his words, a grandpa jersey, but we know you're not that old, Connor. So you also have 3 children, but they're somewhat older than Timmy.
Yeah.
So what is your life like today?
So Tracy, currently, given where I am in life, I mean, my main focus as you get closer to retirement is to consider, am I maximizing my retirement contribution to my pension or provident fund? And then also, I've got 3 kids, so you want to secure their future, their university fees, their school fees. So that's been the big focus for me right now in my life stage. I'm glad I'm out of the babies and nappies stage, but yeah, that's the big focus right now.
Okay, so yeah, a lot older, a lot closer to needing that money. So I'm sure you have a different strategy, as you're saying your eldest is 16. So what is your strategy in terms of saving for your children, providing for their education?
So Tracy, I've always been a big fan of tax-free savings, as you mentioned earlier. And for them, I mean, I've got a tax-free savings account and it's invested in the Net Group Investments core range. And then I've also got a bit of offshore feeder fund and the Net Group Investments core global feeder fund. And then after your last webinar, I realized I should consider having international hard currency exposure, consider the dollar funds. And the reason why I've always liked the feeder funds over the years is that it's just much simpler to invest in, similar to what Tumi was saying. And right now, with the NetBank Money app, you can invest in like under 3 minutes. You can open up invest in an international feeder fund, and it's seamless. It's absolutely seamless. So, whereas if you invest offshore, as you mentioned in your recap, you've got to jump through quite a number of hoops to get your money offshore. But right now, I've got a 16-year-old, as you mentioned as well, and she's starting to make noises about wanting to study abroad. And that's what sparked maybe I should consider investing in hard currency international assets. And there I would consider the Net Group Investments core global fund, the dollar-denominated fund. And I know you're thinking, why am I talking about the core global funds and the core range, the passive range that we offer? Purely because I'm a cheapskate, to be honest. I don't like paying up. And that's just the nature of how we grew up, really. And knowing that I can, without compromising the value that you get in return. And the core range is low cost without compromising your long-term returns. And that's why I've always been a big fan, especially for my kids.
Oh, that's some great tips. So for my colleagues and this, I promise I didn't pay him to promote our range because that's the team I'm from. But I think what is nice in the international context, which you mentioned, is you don't have to go do all that investigation. With the core range, it's very well diversified, and you're not having to pick winning managers and did I pick the right manager? So I think that is great if you're not sure and you're not as familiar with that space.
Yeah, and I think because I don't watch the markets every day, I'm not a trader, I'm a long-term investor, and knowing that I've got exposure to Apple and Microsoft and Amazon through the global the core global feeder, it's fine. So every time I see Apple's earnings or Amazon's earnings, I feel, okay, I've got a bit of that.
Feel a part of the world.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I think you raised some really good points. And I know, again, the same theme as Tumi is, whew, international, this is, I need to be prepared for this. And actually, I know when you did it, and I know similar to what Tumi was saying, you were surprised, actually, like, really? It took this long? Have I been avoiding it and procrastinating for so long?
And just to let you know, I'm a big fan of digital and online transacting. When you do international hard currencies, you go to paper, right? So that's always been a bit of like I don't feel like filling out forms. But like right now, as I mentioned, I think the need's rising pretty fast, that maybe I should do it sooner rather than later.
Yeah, so that is a great example for people whose children are planning on studying overseas, or other expenses. You know, if you're thinking of immigrating or something where you're going to actually need that money outside of the country, it's a really good example of where the fully fledged, I want to call it, international fund that requires a little bit more paperwork, as you said, as opposed to digital, is appropriate for those scenarios.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Q.
Absolute pleasure.
So I'd just like to summarize that again with the infographic. So I'm not going to touch on the first two buckets because I think we've spoken quite a lot about that. The one I do want to focus on is for people in this stage, they can have additional income because their careers have progressed. They still have a lot of responsibilities, but they might have that additional money to be able to save for wealth creation, for passing on legacy. And I just wanted to touch on that as well. And here is really where you would have quite a high portion of international generally, because it's such a long-term investment. You can handle that volatility. I mean, we know the Rand last year was 19 and now it's back down again. And so really it's not suitable for shorter term investments. And as Conrad said, you can use a feeder fund. You might decide a feeder fund, which is accessed in Rands, is the only one that you need. However, for some people, you can consider at a later stage whether the fully fledged international fund in hard currency, in dollars or pounds or yen, is suitable for you either from the start, or you could transfer later on as circumstances change. So really in that category, ideally you're looking at more than 50% international because of the time you've got and because of the diversification it gives you. So we're going to move to the final scenario, which I'm going to play your retired person, because obviously my colleagues are not retired because by definition we're all working together. But I went through this very recently with my dad, in fact, a few months ago, who's supposed to be retired, but he's working quite a lot for somebody who's supposed to be retired. And again, here I'm just going to focus on the elements that are a little bit different. So his context is a bit unusual in the sense that he didn't really have much in the way of formal retirement savings, despite all my coaching and trying to educate him from being in financial services. But really all of his energy and money went into his business. So when he sold his business, that was effectively the money he had to live off for the rest of his life. That's what had to last. So his money was completely outside of the retirement system. And from that, he obviously needs an income. He needs to live off that. So for the portion he's going to be drawing an income from for the next few years, that was put into the feeder fund. So that's the Rand-based fund. And that is accessible. So it's a lot easier to access the money and draw the income. Then for some of the longer term money that's not needed for an income in the next few years, he put into an international fund. And again, the reasoning there was because he wants to be able to access it outside of the country. So it can be an and situation. It doesn't have to be an either or, and sometimes both are appropriate. The other points I wanted to raise here that's quite relevant, especially for people in this category, is often they have a home or property or other assets. And so you might think, well, why would I put him fully in, in international investments? That's a bit irresponsible. But it's because of the property he has here, as well as some money that's still tied up in the company, that's all based in South Africa. And so really it's about looking at your picture holistically, not just at your formal savings or just at your home or just at one piece, but it's important to view everything together. And in that sort of space, the really longer term space, again, you would typically have same principle, more than 50% in international. So that was his case, his life example. But for those people who do have formal retirement savings, I just wanted to touch on that because I think it's relevant to many people. There, you would typically have sort of 30 to 50% when you retire in international. And again, even though you're drawing an income, I think the misconception is often because I'm taking money out, I'm a short-term investor. But life expectancy is about 25 to 30 years at retirement for South Africans. So you're only drawing a small portion out of that money every year. So because you're still a long-term investor, you want that diversification. You ideally want about 50% in international investments. And you have, for a large part of the money, the time horizon to ride out the volatility, but that diversification is going to help reduce your risk. You might also have other savings, which could be there as a buffer, meaning, and I've seen this with my grandparents now, when you get really big unexpected medical bills, so I'm not talking about your typical emergency unexpected things, I'm talking about really significant sums. You could have savings you keep there as a buffer, or you might need to draw an income from those additional savings. And there again, you're looking for a similar 30 to 50% in international, balancing that currency volatility with your diversification. So I hope that gives you a good summary of some of the case studies and how you can apply it. And even if it wasn't your exact life stage that we discussed, there's definitely principles and you can see them consistently coming through. So to show you what exactly those principles are that are coming through before we go to the questions and answers, is I've summarized everything today we discussed with 2 infographics. The first infographic is anybody who's still in the savings phase. So I've called it pre-retirement, but really you're not drawing an income from your savings. And there your first bucket is your very short-term goals, house deposits, car deposits, emergency savings. You'd have very little international. Then sort of in your mid bucket, which would be your company retirement fund, potentially your tax-free savings, your children's tax-free savings. Overall for that bucket, you would typically have 30 to 50% international. Again, on the tax-free savings in both your and your children, you can have quite a bit more because you have the time. And the final one would be that wealth creation bucket, which we just spoke about, where you can have a lot more in the way of international. And this is really a sort of not for anything specific, general wealth creation and legacy. So that gives a nice overview of those people who are not yet needing an income. And just again, remember the picture of the house, to bear in mind your bigger picture of everything together and not focusing on sort of the small micro accounts. Then the only real difference when you retire or you need income from these savings is that middle bucket, where now you have a bit more flexibility. So pre-retirement in your formal retirement savings, you're restricted on how much international you can have. Here you've got a bit more scope and you want to aim closer to the 50% mark when you are going to be drawing a regular income. So that's really an overview of what we discussed today. And if there are questions and answers, I'm not sure if there are, we'll see now, then please let us know and we'll answer them now. While we're waiting for the questions and answers, if there are audience members wanting to ask, we have got contact details here, that if you have any questions about your international investments or if you would like to open, that you're welcome to do that. The pack will also be sent out afterwards to attendees, so I know if you missed it, then you will receive that and there will also be a recording done of today's presentation. Okay, so I see there's one question come through so far, and it says, where one is invested directly offshore, does an investor require a separate will, I think it's supposed to be and executor, for the assets? So I'm not an expert on this, so I'm going to give you my knowledge, but please, it's better to formalize this. If you have assets outside of South Africa, you can put it in your South African will and state it there, but should you pass away or when you pass away, that local executor will need to appoint or get approval to be the offshore executor. So there are implications around your will. You can choose, if you would like, to have a separate offshore will and a separate local will. And in some cases, that might be more favorable. So there's definitely considerations around estate planning. I actually did for my parents, an example I used, I put theirs into what's called an international endowment. So you can think of it almost like wrapping that investment up in something. And that basically pays out like a life insurance policy would pay out. So you don't need an executor there. The process is a lot quicker. You do pay extra fees, but there are other ways to sort of, I would say, package the offshore investments that are still physically accessible outside of the country that can help get around some of the complications here. So I'm not seeing any more questions coming up here. I don't know if Tumi or Carnett have anything they want to add to our discussion or to the question.
Yeah, no, not at this stage, but I mean, I think definitely what we've taken away is that obviously at different life stages, you know, you've got different needs that come up, and whether you're right at the beginning or me in the middle stage or Q where he is, there's definitely, you know, a need, or there is a place for you to have offshore exposure, and it's really great that you're able just to take us through, you know, the various ways in which you can get that exposure. So yeah.
You're actually reminding me of something, Tumi, that I really wanted to talk to Carnett about. And he actually had a really great example talking about when you should be using offshore of his first job, that when we were discussing this, he mentioned. So can you share that with us, please?
Yes. So in my first job, one of the first lessons my boss taught me, and it was the first day in the new job, and I just graduated out of university, and he tells me, and I think he may even be on the call today, and he tells me, Carnello, you never leave the dance floor while the DJ is playing his song. Now remember, I'm a youngster out of university. I'm like, what is he talking about? And years later, I realized what he was saying. The DJ is your investment time horizon. The DJ playing the song is your life and your investment time horizon. The dancing is your investment. So what he was trying to say is you can never time the market. And the second lesson he taught me was that if all your investment portfolios are outperforming, it means you're not properly diversified. So my investments in the Rand feeder funds, or my offshore exposure, is not based on where the Rand is. It's purely based on diversification and getting exposure to companies that we don't ordinarily have access to or exposure to in South Africa, like I mentioned, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and the likes. So that was my very important lesson for a young junior analyst joining the industry, and I've never forgotten it. And that's how I've always managed my investment, my personal investments. Focus on the long term, don't time the market, and the longer you invested, the less you pay, and the more profits you gain out of your investments. Time.
No, I love that analogy, because you might miss that one special dance, that special goal if you left the dance floor. So I think it ties it up really nicely, especially for us as South Africans. I know, and if you watch the media, you'll see it, especially the financial media. The Rand blows out and suddenly the country is falling apart and we must get all our money outside of the country. And I think we can be quite reactive sometimes. And like you're saying, if you're jumping in and out, you could miss that one really special person that you want to dance with.
Absolutely, Tracy. And it's been proven over and over again that if you're timing the markets, especially the currency, which is exceptionally volatile, as you know, you're only going to end up in tears.
Oh, it's a great point. So I'm glad, Tumi, your statement reminded me of that. I see we've got a few more questions that have come through since we've been having our discussion. One of the questions here is, how do I get exposure to global emerging markets other than South Africa? So we actually have a global emerging markets fund that is accessible. So if you go onto our website, www.nedgroupinvestments.co.za, there is a fund there that specifically focuses on emerging markets. So that's a really great way to look at getting exposure there. Then there's a few more questions. Given the high level of market valuations around the world, particularly in the US equity market, shouldn't we rather look at actively managed strategies rather than passively managed strategies? So just to fill everyone in, and I know Connor touched on it earlier, a passive strategy is when you effectively track the market. You don't make calls on whether it's cheap or expensive. Whereas an actively managed strategy, you have teams of analysts determining what's expensive, what's cheap, and making active decisions, for want of a better word, around those strategies. So, I mean, I think it's really, really difficult in terms of market valuations. I remember at the end of last year already, there was a lot of talk about markets being expensive, and they've subsequently risen. So I think it's really hard, as Connet was saying, to time it. I know for my own money, I know that I don't know what I don't know. So I never try and time the market. It's more about time in the market. And so really, I think that whole passive active decision is really up to you personally. I'm very passive. That is where my money is. And I'm in it for the long term. So for me, I'm not too phased around fluctuations and short-term valuations. And for me, the low costs, like Connet was saying in his words about being a cheapskate, the costs in the long run for me are very critical. But I think it's really a personal preference, as you're saying. Some people prefer actively managed, and there are definitely managers who get that right. There are other managers who get that wrong. So it's your, I guess, decision on how you would like to access the international investments.
Tracy,
do you want to add? Go for it.
So Net Group Investments, we do offer actively managed funds, a range of award-winning global managed funds. So it's not because I don't like them, it's just my personal preference. They are award-winning, as I mentioned, and some of them have consistently outperformed. But if you are interested in our actively managed range of international funds, I would urge you to contact our client services center. I know Tracy put up their contact details on the slide. So by all means, speak to them. They can provide you with all the information you require, and you can make that decision.
Conan, I mean, that's a great point. Not that this is a promo, yeah. But Net Group Investments, over the last few years, 5 times actually won one of the best international, in fact, I think it was the best international investment manager. So it's a really great way for South Africans to have a local contact, but still have that offshore expertise.
Absolutely, correct.
So yes, that is our speciality, one of our specialities. Okay, we've got a few more questions here. So it says, with respect to unit trusts or other funds, when you start drawing an income later in life, do you suggest that you actually draw from the capital, or do you have strong enough capital assets to only draw income distributions? And so here what the question's referring to is, in your investments, you might have dividends from your shares, you might have income coming from property investments, income coming from sort of interest earning investments. So do you just take the dividends sort of and the income and that growth and try live off that, which can also be volatile, or do you focus sort of on drawing from your capital as well? And I have quite specific views on that. I very much see the return as a holistic return, especially if it comes from formal retirement savings, because you're sort of agnostic on tax as to where it came from. But for most people, the reality in South Africa is, unfortunately, they have to eat into their capital. And the only way you can really recommend doing that is to do it sustainably. You know, so don't take 10% out of your investments every year and live off that, because you're not going to eat into your capital sustainably. But for people who do need to do that, which is the majority of South Africans, it is okay to live off some of the capital, but it's about doing it in a responsible manner. And we've actually got a tool and a coach who can assist with that. It's called the My Retirement Offering. And if you are looking for something like that, we've definitely got a coach who can assist you free of charge with helping you what is a sustainable drawdown to take. So yeah, my view is very much view your return holistically as opposed to splitting it into sort of income and capital return. Okay, we've got more. I see there's more and more questions coming in. We've got 5 minutes left, so we will try and get through the last few questions. So it says, how should I manage currency fluctuations if I buy US dollar denominated investment products? So I think the whole purpose of this really is, ideally this should be a long-term investment, which means you shouldn't be too concerned with those fluctuations, unless, of course, like the example Carnett gave, if your daughter's 16 and she's going to be drawing it in 2 years' time, and you're going to be coughing up dollars. I know one of our other colleagues' son is studying in the US, and she had to 19 rand to the dollar be paying for that. You know, then obviously it's a big concern. But I think that's a bit of a different scenario. In general, your international investments, you want it as a long-term investment, so you shouldn't be needing to manage those shorter-term fluctuations. If it is something that has a lot shorter time horizon, generally you don't want to have much in the way of international in that area of your investments, unless, as we said, it's a very specific example, like you're going to be needing the money, such as the schooling, university example we discussed. Okay, then there's a question about clarifying how tax works on the two offshore accounts. So that's a really good question. So in terms of capital gains tax, in the feeder fund, if the rand appreciates, your capital gains tax will be lower. If the rand depreciates, so loses value, then your capital gains tax in the direct offshore fund, the international fund, will be lower. So most South Africans have the view that in the long run that the rand will depreciate, in which case your capital gains tax will be slightly lower in the international fund. And that is because in the feeder fund, your capital gain is based on the move in the currency plus the move in the underlying investments. Whereas in the actual international fund, it's based on just the move in the investments multiplied by the exchange rate at that time. Okay, one last question, and then I think we need to wrap up because we're almost out of time, is what is a reasonable expectation from global equities over the long term? So historically, I mean, it's very hard and everybody's long term is different, but historically, over the very long run, you've sort of got around about 7% above inflation, above South African inflation now, but that really can fluctuate significantly over any 1 year. So I don't know, I thought you wanted to add something. No. Okay. Yeah, so that's all the questions we have time for today. As we said, we will send out the presentation after this, and there will also be a recording. And please do make use of those contact details. If you do have any questions or specific interests, I see there were some relevant questions for people who might want to make contact with our call center. And thank you so much for your time today. I know you're all busy and there's lots on your plate. So thank you for your questions and for your engagement. And thanks to me and Q for coming to share a bit of your lives with us.
An absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you.